Lifeguard Zoe Harper dragged by Orca in ocean tragedy. The sun hung lazily over the beach, casting a golden glow on the calm waters of the Pacific. Waves lapped gently at the shoreline, their rhythmic murmur providing a soothing backdrop to the buzz of activity on the sand. Lifeguards patrolled the beach, their bright red uniforms a familiar and comforting sight for the beachgoers soaking up the early morning sun. Children played with buckets and spades, building castles that would soon fall to the tide, while surfers dotted the horizon, waiting for the perfect wave. Zoe Harper stood at the lifeguard station, her sharp eyes scanning the expanse of water before her. Every shift, she reminded herself of the responsibility she carried, a watchful guardian of those who entrusted their safety to the sea. She had grown up on these very shores, the ocean a constant companion throughout her life. It was her playground, her sanctuary, and eventually her calling. Becoming a lifeguard had been a natural step for Zoe. She thrived on the challenge, the adrenaline rush that came with the unexpected, and the deep sense of purpose that the job gave her. As she adjusted her sunglasses, a soft breeze carried the familiar scent of salt and sunscreen. It was a perfect day. Clear skies, calm waters, and just enough wind to keep the heat at bay. Yet, despite the idyllic scene, an unexplainable tension prickled at the edge of her consciousness. She couldn't put her finger on it, but it was there, a whisper of something yet to come. Zoe called out her colleague, Mark, waving a thermos at her from the shade of the lifeguard hut. Coffee break. Zoe smiled, her tension momentarily forgotten. You read my mind, she said, hopping down from the observation tower and walking toward him. The sand was warm beneath her feet, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to relax. After all, she had earned it. The coffee was hot and strong, just the way she liked it. She sipped slowly, savoring the warmth as it spread through her. Quiet day so far, Mark said, glancing out at the water. Almost too quiet. Zoe nodded in agreement. It's the kind of quiet that makes me nervous, she admitted, her eyes once again flicking toward the ocean. Like the calm before the storm, Mark chuckled. Relax, Harper. Not every day has to be a drama-filled rescue operation. Enjoy the peace while it lasts. But Zoe couldn't shake the feeling gnawing at her gut. Something was off. She watched a group of dolphins playfully leaping in the distance. Normally, the sight would fill her with joy, but today, it seemed strange. Their movements were frantic, almost erratic, unlike the smooth, synchronized dance she had grown used to seeing over the years. Is it just me, or are they acting weird? She asked, pointing toward the pod. Mark squinted, following her gaze. Maybe they're just excited about something. Or maybe they found a school of fish. Zoe wasn't convinced, but she let it go for the moment. Dolphins were intelligent, complex creatures, and their behavior often carried meanings beyond human comprehension. Still, she filed the observation away in the back of her mind, just in case. Minutes later, the peaceful atmosphere was shattered by the sound of a distant whistle. Zoe's head snapped up, her instincts kicking in instantly. A man was frantically waving his arms from a kayak far out beyond the swimming zone. Even from a distance, Zoe could see the panic in his movements. Something was wrong. I've got it, she said, already sprinting toward the water. Her heart began to pound, not from the exertion but from the adrenaline flooding her system. She grabbed her rescue board and launched herself into the surf, her muscles burning with the familiar effort of paddling against the current. The water was colder than she expected, a sharp contrast to the warm air, but she didn't have time to dwell on it. As she drew closer to the kayaker, she could make out more details. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. He clung to the side of his overturned kayak, the paddle floating nearby, useless in the churning water. But it wasn't the capsized kayak that caught Zoe's attention. It was the shadow in the water beneath him. At first, it was just a fleeting glimpse, a dark shape gliding beneath the surface, too large to be a dolphin. Zoe's breath caught in her throat as she realized what it was. An orca. Hold on, she called to the man, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. I'm coming. Zoe reached him in seconds, her rescue board providing a steady platform as she helped him climb aboard. "Are you hurt?" she asked, scanning him for any signs of injury. "And no," he stammered, his teeth chattering from the cold. "But the whale, it came out of nowhere. It bumped my kayak, like it was trying to..." Before he could finish, the orca resurfaced, just a few meters away. Its sleek black and white body cut through the water with terrifying grace. Zoe had seen orcas before, but never this close. Its dorsal fin towered above the waves, a stark reminder of its immense power. "Stay calm," Zoe instructed, her voice calm and authoritative. "We'll be fine. Just hold on tight." The orca circled them once, twice, as if assessing the situation. Zoe's mind raced, trying to decipher its intentions. Orcas were known to be curious, but they rarely posed a threat to humans. Was it protecting its territory? Had it mistaken the kayak for something else? Or was it simply playing a game that neither she nor the kayaker wanted to be part of? Without warning, the orca dove beneath the surface again, disappearing into the depths. Zoe tightened her grip on the board, her eyes scanning the water for any sign of its return. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Then it happened. The orca reappeared with breathtaking speed, its powerful body breaking the surface just inches from Zoe. Its tail flicked with startling precision, knocking the rescue board sideways and sending both Zoe and the kayaker into the water. The cold hit her like a shockwave, stealing the breath from her lungs. Zoe fought to keep her head above water, her instincts screaming at her to swim, to move, to escape. But before she could react, she felt something. An immense force wrapping around her legs, pulling her downward. It was the orca. It had caught her wetsuit in its jaws and was dragging her beneath the waves. Zoe's mind went blank with panic. Her world became a blur of water and bubbles, her body twisting and turning as the orca propelled her deeper into the ocean. She clawed at the water, desperate for air, her lungs burning with the need to breathe. The surface seemed impossibly far away, a shimmering mirage above her. 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind in an instant. Would this be the end? Would she drown here, in the very ocean she had loved her entire life? The irony was almost cruel. But even in the face of overwhelming fear, a spark of defiance flared within her. No, she would not give up. She had survived too much, fought too hard, to let it end like this. Zoe twisted her body, reaching for the strap of her rescue board, which was still attached to her wrist. She yanked it with all her strength, pulling the board toward her. The sudden resistance seemed to startle the orca, which loosened its grip just enough for Zoe to kick free. She shot toward the surface, her arms and legs working furiously. Her lungs screamed for oxygen, her vision darkening at the edges. Just a little further, just a few more feet. The moment her head broke the surface, Zoe gasped for air, the sweet taste of oxygen filling her lungs. She coughed and sputtered, her body trembling with the effort of staying afloat. The world around her felt surreal, the sky too bright, the water too cold. But she was alive. Somehow, against all odds, she had survived. Zoe floated for a moment, her arms and legs heavy from the struggle. The world seemed to spin around her, the horizon tilting unnaturally as her body fought to recover from the sudden lack of oxygen. Her chest burned with every breath, her lungs demanding more air than she could provide. Her mind screamed at her to move, but her muscles felt paralyzed, stuck between the shock and the lingering grip of panic. She glanced around frantically, trying to regain her bearings. The overturned kayak bobbed a few feet away, but the kayaker was nowhere to be seen. Fear gripped her heart again as she tried to piece together what had just happened. Where was he? Had he been dragged under too? Was the orca still circling beneath her, waiting to strike again? "Help!" Zoe croaked, her voice barely audible over the sound of the waves. She tried again, forcing the word out with all her strength. "Help!" A figure appeared in the distance, a lifeguard boat speeding toward her, its engine cutting through the water with a deafening roar. Relief surged through Zoe, but it was fleeting. Every second the boat took to reach her felt like an eternity. She could still feel the presence of the orca, the weight of its immense power lingering in the water around her like an unseen force. Her limbs refused to cooperate, moving sluggishly as she tried to keep herself afloat. She knew she had to stay calm, to conserve her energy, but it was nearly impossible. The cold had seeped into her bones, and every muscle in her body screamed in protest. Zoe blinked rapidly, her vision blurring as exhaustion threatened to take over. Suddenly, the boat was there. 2 lifeguards leaned over the side, their faces filled with urgent concern. One of them was Mark. "Zoe, hold on," he shouted, reaching out with a rescue pole. His voice, though loud, was tinged with panic. He had never seen Zoe like this, so vulnerable, so close to the edge of her strength. Zoe reached for the pole, her fingers trembling as they closed around it. With a sharp tug, Mark and the other lifeguard pulled her toward the boat. The moment her body made contact with the metal hull, she let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Mark grabbed her under the arms, hauling her up onto the deck with surprising strength. She collapsed onto her back, gasping for air, her eyes wide and unfocused. Water streamed from her wetsuit, pooling around her as she lay there, unable to move. "Zoe, can you hear me?" Mark asked, crouching beside her. His voice was steady but urgent, the professional demeanor of a seasoned lifeguard taking over. "You're safe now. Just breathe. You're okay." Zoe nodded weakly, her eyes fluttering shut for a moment. She could feel her body trembling uncontrollably, her teeth chattering from the cold. The kayaker," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Where is he?" Mark exchanged a quick glance with the other lifeguard. "We're looking for him," he assured her. "Right now, we need to focus on you. You're hypothermic. We've got to get you warmed up." "No," Zoe insisted, her voice gaining a bit more strength. "Find him. He went under." Mark hesitated for a split second before nodding. "We will. Promise." The boat surged forward again, the engine roaring as they resumed their search. Zoe sat up slowly, ignoring the dizziness that threatened to overwhelm her. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stop the violent shivering that racked her body. The cold had taken hold of her, and it wasn't letting go. Her mind refused to rest. She couldn't shake the image of the orca's eyes, the dark, intelligent gaze that had met hers underwater. It hadn't felt like an accident. The orca had been deliberate, almost calculating in its actions. But why? Orcas weren't known for attacking humans. What had triggered it? Was it protecting something? Or had it been a freak incident? An unfortunate collision between human and nature? Time seemed to blur as the boat scanned the water. Minutes passed, then longer. Zoe's heart sank deeper with every empty stretch of ocean they searched. Her mind played out a dozen scenarios, each more devastating than the last. The guilt settled heavy in her chest. She had gotten free, but the kayaker might not have been so lucky. A sharp whistle from the front of the boat snapped her out of her thoughts. "There," one of the lifeguards called, pointing toward the water. Zoe followed his gaze and spotted a flash of orange, the life vest of the kayaker, barely visible above the waves. The boat veered toward him, and Zoe felt her pulse quicken. As they drew closer, she saw that he was floating face up, his eyes closed, his body eerily still. "Get him on board," Mark shouted, leaping into action. The boat slowed just enough for the lifeguards to pull the kayaker aboard. His face was pale, his lips tinged blue, but he was breathing barely. "Call it in," Mark barked, already checking the man's pulse and airway. "We need paramedics waiting at the dock. He's hypothermic and semi-conscious." Zoe watched helplessly as they worked to stabilize him, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. She knew the signs all too well, the shallow breathing, the sluggish response. Hypothermia was a cruel enemy, but it wasn't unbeatable. If they could get him to the shore quickly, he had a chance. The boat surged toward land, its engine roaring louder than before. Zoe gripped the side, her knuckles white as she willed the shoreline to come faster. Every second counted. Her thoughts drifted back to the moment underwater, to the orca's grip and the overwhelming sensation of being completely at its mercy. The ocean, for all its beauty, was a force beyond human control. A vast, untamable wilderness where the rules were different, where survival wasn't guaranteed. As the boat approached the dock, a crowd had already gathered. Paramedics rushed forward, their faces a blur as they lifted the kayaker onto a waiting stretcher. Zoe stumbled after them, her legs weak, her breath ragged. The world spun around her, a cacophony of voices and movement. "You need to be checked out too," Mark said, his hand steadying her. "You're freezing. Let them take a look at you." "I'm fine," Zoe insisted, though her trembling body betrayed her words. "Take care of him first." But even as she spoke, the adrenaline began to wear off, leaving only exhaustion and cold in its wake. Her knees buckled, and Mark caught her before she hit the ground. "You're not fine," he said firmly. "You're coming with me." Zoe didn't have the strength to argue. She let Mark guide her toward the waiting ambulance, her mind still spinning with questions that had no answers. What had just happened out there? Why had the Orca acted that way? And would she ever feel truly safe in the water again? The fluorescent lights of the hospital flickered faintly above Zoe as she lay on the bed, a thin blanket draped over her trembling body. The hum of nearby machines and the occasional murmur of voices filtered through the quiet emergency room. The warmth of the heated blanket helped, but it was doing little to thaw the deep chill that had settled into her bones. She stared at the ceiling, her mind replaying the incident over and over, each detail etched into her memory with sharp precision. The cold water, the pressure of the Orca's grip, the sheer force dragging her downward. It was all too vivid. Every time she closed her eyes, she was back in the depths of the ocean, fighting to breathe, struggling to break free. A soft knock at the door broke her from the spiral of her thoughts. Mark stepped in, his expression a mix of relief and concern. "Hey," he said gently, pulling up a chair beside her bed. "How are you holding up?" Zoe gave a tired smile. "I've been better," he chuckled, though the sound was tinged with nervous energy. "Yeah, I figured. You scared the hell out of me. You know that?" "I scared myself," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought that was it, Mark. I really did." Mark's face grew serious. "I've never seen anything like that. An Orca acting like that? It's unheard of. I mean, they're curious creatures, sure, but aggressive? That's not normal." Zoe nodded, her thoughts once again drifting back to the Orca's eyes. Intense, calculating, almost as if it had been testing her. "It didn't feel like an accident," she said softly. "It felt deliberate, like it knew exactly what it was doing." A silence hung between them, heavy with unspoken questions. Mark cleared his throat. "The kayaker's stable, by the way. They're monitoring him closely, but it looks like he's going to be okay." Relief washed over Zoe like a warm tide. "Thank God," she breathed. "I was so worried. I couldn't stop thinking about him out there." Mark reached out, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. "You did everything you could, Zoe. You saved his life. Don't forget that." But the weight of what had happened wasn't so easily lifted. Even though she had survived, even though the kayaker was safe, the experience had left an indelible mark on her soul. The ocean, her sanctuary, now felt like a place filled with questions she couldn't answer, dangers she couldn't predict. A nurse entered the room, checking Zoe's vitals and taking her temperature. "Your body temperature's almost back to normal," she said with a warm smile. "You're a tough one. Most people would still be out cold after what you've been through." Zoe nodded absently, her mind still elsewhere. The nurse finished her checks and left, leaving the two of them alone once again. "They're going to want to investigate the incident," Mark said after a moment. "Figure out what triggered the Orca's behavior. Marine biologists will probably want to talk to you." "I'll tell them everything," Zoe said without hesitation. "I want to understand it too. Orcas aren't like that. There has to be a reason." Mark leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. Maybe it was defending its territory, or protecting a calf. "Maybe," Zoe replied, but something about that explanation didn't sit right with her. The Orca's behavior hadn't felt protective. It had felt exploratory, almost as if it had been testing boundaries, seeing what she would do. The door opened again, and this time a man in a neatly pressed suit stepped inside. His expression was calm but serious, his eyes sharp as they scanned the room. He introduced himself as Dr. Larson, a marine behavior specialist who had been called in to assist with the investigation. "Miss Harper," he began, his voice smooth and authoritative. "I'm glad to see you're doing well. I've already spoken with your colleagues and reviewed their accounts of the incident. I'd like to hear it from you now." Zoe sat up a little straighter, her body protesting the movement but her mind eager to make sense of what had happened. "It started with a distress call from a kayaker," she began, recounting the events in detail. She told him about the dark shadow beneath the surface, the initial playful circling that quickly turned aggressive, and the moment the orca dragged her under. Dr. Larson listened intently, nodding at intervals but remaining mostly silent. When she finished, he leaned forward, his hands clasped. "This is highly unusual," he said finally. "Orcas are known for their intelligence and complex social behaviors, but aggression toward humans is almost unheard of. We've had a few isolated incidents worldwide, but nothing quite like this. So, what do you think caused it?" Zoe asked, her heart pounding a little faster. Dr. Larson hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "There are a few possibilities. Could have been environmental stress, changes in the ecosystem that disrupted the pod's behavior. It's also possible the orca mistook you for prey or was simply playing too rough. But there's another theory." Zoe leaned in, her curiosity piqued. "What theory?" "Human interference," Dr. Larson said, his tone darkening. "Over the past few years, there's been an increase in illegal fishing operations along this stretch of the coast. Some of these operations encroach on orca territory, leading to heightened aggression and unusual behavior. If this pod was disrupted or threatened, it might explain what happened." The weight of his words settled heavily on Zoe's chest. The idea that human activity could have driven the orca to act out in such a way was both heartbreaking and infuriating. The ocean was already facing enough challenges: pollution, climate change, overfishing. And now, even the creatures that called it home were suffering the consequences. "What happens now?" she asked. Dr. Larson gave a small sigh. "We'll monitor the pod closely and investigate further. If we find any evidence of illegal activity, we'll take appropriate action. But for now, the best thing you can do is rest and recover." Zoe nodded, but rest seemed like an impossible task. Her mind was too full, too restless. She had always believed in protecting the ocean and its creatures, but now it felt personal. She had seen firsthand the consequences of human carelessness, and it had nearly cost her life. "I want to help," she said suddenly, her voice firm. "Whatever you're doing to monitor the pod or stop illegal operations, I want to be part of it." Dr. Larson looked at her with a hint of admiration. "That kind of determination is rare, Miss Harper. I'll make sure you're kept in the loop." With that, he stood and extended his hand. Zoe shook it, feeling a renewed sense of purpose stir within her. She wasn't just a survivor, she was a protector, and she wasn't about to let this incident fade into memory without finding answers. As the door closed behind him, Zoe leaned back against the pillow, exhaustion tugging at her once again. But this time it felt different. She had faced the depths of the ocean and lived to tell the tale. Now it was time to fight for the ocean that had always been her home. Days passed in a blur of hospital routines and cautious recovery. Zoe stayed mostly quiet, trying to piece together her emotions. The doctors kept reminding her how lucky she was to have survived, how close she had come to something far worse. But luck felt like an inadequate explanation for what had happened. Her body was healing, but her mind refused to let her rest. She lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying the encounter with the orca in her head. Every detail haunted her. The cold grip of the water, the orca's dark, unblinking eye, the raw power that had yanked her under. It wasn't just fear she felt. It was a strange mix of awe and sadness. That creature wasn't a monster. It was something far more complex. What had driven it to act that way? The hospital room's walls felt too close, too sterile. And after a few days, Zoe began to crave the open air, the salt breeze, the crash of waves that had been her lifelong soundtrack. On the morning of her discharge, Mark arrived to take her home. His familiar smile was a welcome sight. "Ready to escape?" he asked, holding up a paper bag with fresh clothes. "Figured you'd want to wear something other than that hospital gown." Zoe chuckled softly. "You figured right." The ride back to her apartment was quiet at first, filled with the hum of the tires on pavement. Mark kept stealing glances at her, his face torn between relief and worry. "You know you don't have to go back right away," he said finally, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. "You've been through enough. No one expects you to jump back into lifeguarding." "I'm not going back just yet," Zoe said, her gaze fixed on the ocean stretching out beside the road. "But I need to be there. I need to see it. I can't be afraid of the water, Mark. It's my home." He didn't argue. He knew her well enough to recognize that once Zoe had made up her mind, there was no changing it. When they arrived at the beach, Zoe stood at the edge of the sand, letting the wind whip her hair around her face. The sound of the waves, so familiar and comforting, seemed different now, deeper, more mysterious. She took a hesitant step forward, her feet sinking into the soft sand. Each step brought her closer to the water's edge, where the tide lapped gently at her toes. Mark stayed back, giving her space. He understood that this was something Zoe needed to do alone. Zoe crouched down, running her fingers through the wet sand, feeling the coolness seep into her skin. For a brief moment, she closed her eyes and allowed herself to simply breathe, inhaling the salty air that had always felt like home. Memories flooded back. Early mornings on this very beach, watching the sun rise over the horizon. Long summer days spent swimming and surfing until her skin was sun-kissed and salty. She took a step closer to the water, her heart thudding in her chest. The ocean stretched before her, vast and endless. It had always been her refuge, her sanctuary, but now it felt different. Not a threat, never that, but something wilder and more unpredictable than she had ever given it credit for. A soft splash caught her attention. A few yards offshore, a pod of dolphins arched gracefully out of the water, their bodies glistening in the sunlight. Zoe watched, her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she thought she saw something larger, a dark shape gliding just beneath the surface. Her pulse quickened. Could it be the same Orca? The shape lingered for a moment before disappearing back into the depths, leaving only ripples behind. Zoe remained frozen, her eyes scanning the water, half expecting the creature to resurface. But it didn't. "It's watching," she whispered, almost to herself. Mark stepped beside her, following her gaze. "What is?" "The Orca," she said. "It's still out there. I saw it." He frowned, scanning the waves but seeing nothing. "Are you sure?" "Could have been anything." Zoe shook her head. "No, it was the same one. I know it." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the waves washing over their feet. The tide pulled at the sand beneath them, and Zoe felt that strange connection to the water again. A deep, unspoken understanding that went beyond words. She wasn't afraid anymore. The fear had been replaced by something else. Curiosity. Respect. "They're smarter than we give them credit for," she said softly. "It wasn't trying to hurt me. I think it was trying to communicate in its own way. Maybe it was warning me about something." Mark glanced at her, his brow furrowed. "Warning you? About us," she replied, her voice gaining strength. "About what we're doing to their world. We've pushed too far, disrupted too much. I felt it, Mark. That Orca was showing me something, trying to tell me that they're not just watching. They're reacting." Mark was quiet for a moment, absorbing her words. "So what do we do?" Zoe turned to him, her eyes bright with determination. "We fight for them. We protect the ocean, no matter what it takes." A faint smile tugged at Mark's lips. "I had a feeling you'd say that." They stood there for a while longer, watching the waves roll in and out, their thoughts carried by the wind. For the first time since the incident, Zoe felt a strange sense of peace. The ocean hadn't betrayed her. It had tested her, reminded her of its power, its vastness. And now it was calling her back, not as a lifeguard, but as a guardian. As the sun began to set, casting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Zoe made a silent promise to the ocean. She would listen, she would protect, and no matter how far she had to go, she would fight for its survival. The dark shape beneath the waves remained unseen, but Zoe knew it was still there, watching, waiting, and somehow she felt comforted by its presence. The ocean was her home, and she was ready to fight for it.